This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode with Drew Ricketts, Joe Gerken, and special guest Danny Lindahl begins today's show. They discuss dire wolves and what they could mean for the environment. A cattle market update from University of Nebraska-Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis keeps the show moving as he talks about futures prices, the Cattle on Feed Report, JBS, and New World screwworm. Ending the show is K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk, as he says producers can get a jump on controlling flies on the dairy by using a multi-pronged approach. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode from K-State's Joe Gerken and Drew Ricketts, as well as special guest Danny Lindahl, who is their video production specialist.
From what the headlines have said, the first immediate reaction was they're bringing back dire wolves. It's full Jurassic Park. They went and found the DNA, and then they made the wolves, and now they've got dire wolves again, and they're this huge wolf. That's about all I know about dire wolves. Mm-hmm. And then there's the reaction from the other side that's like, actually, these aren't dire wolves at all. What they did is just, spray painting a regular wolf and then called it a dire wolf. Maybe they found a big one. And there's just that huge, big reaction from both sides. And so I'm kind of, from what I understand, it's somewhere in the middle where they did some DNA editing to some extent, but maybe not enough to call it a dire wolf. And also, what even is de-extinction? Is that a thing? Is that good to do or anything like that? So I guess what happened? What did they actually do?
Yeah, well, I don't know some of the nitty-gritty details, so hopefully between Joe and I we can get most of it right. But, from my understanding, they had some wolf pups that hadn't been born yet, and they used gene editing technology to basically give them some genes that were similar to genes that make dire wolves appear the way that they do, from their color to their size and that sort of thing. And again, I don't know the nitty-gritty, but ancient DNA is like really crappy stuff, and it's really hard to work with. Sometimes they have a hard time just even identifying a critter based on ancient DNA. So my guess is that they didn't actually take dire wolf DNA, let's say from a carcass that they found mummified in a glacier or something like that. I doubt they took that kind of DNA and then just stuck it into a wolf embryo. Tell me if I'm wrong, Joe.
No, I think you're right. The way that it's been described to me, gene editing, is, I think the analogy of a Lego set is really good. And so if we think about building an animal, it's kind of like building, Legos. So we're putting together all the different pieces, and the instructions are telling us what piece to put in what place in order to get a certain animal at the end of it. And what gene editing has done is say, okay, instead of blue eyes, we want red eyes. And so we're going to replace those certain Legos that would be blue with red Legos, or we're going to replace brown fur with white fur. And so if we think about doing that, most of the instruction manual is going to stay the same, but there's going to be little areas that we can copy and paste. We're going to take out some of the areas that maybe have the most, clear cut, make something look like another animal, and replace those with something that makes it look like something else. So really what they've done is go in and find little pockets where they can change the amount of fur or the fur color and replace just that little instruction part of the Lego set to create an animal that looks like a dire wolf, right? And so a majority of the genetic material that's still there would be of the source organism, which is a different type of wolf that's still living, right? So
the gray wolf, right?
Yeah, gray wolves.
Just for reference, what can you tell me about dire wolves? Like, how big are they? What habitat? Why did they go extinct? Kind of, I guess, a Reader's Digest version of a summary.
Yeah, and I'm a mammologist, and I guess I'm a pretty poor mammologist because I don't know a ton of details about dire wolves. But, during the last glacial maximum time, when we had ice ages that came and went and all those sorts of things, there were a whole bunch of these really, really big mammals that existed in North America. There were several different species of mammoths. There were mastodons. There were a couple of different horses. There were like 5 or 7 different species of really large cats that were all like bigger than lions and tigers. There were 2 different species of cheetahs in North America.
Wow.
And dire wolves were one of those species. And they're much bigger than gray wolves.
How big? Could you ride one?
I don't know.
I don't think they were that big. I think they were 1.5 times as big as a wolf. Kind of going from like a dog to a wolf might be a good analogy.
A big gray wolf is going to be 150 pounds.
Where are the gray wolves now? Because I've never seen one.
Sure. So there's a whole bunch up where your family's from, the Great Lakes region.
Okay. Minnesota.
Yep. Northern Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin. That's an area where they've been very, very successful. So successful, in fact, that there were hunting seasons and trapping seasons opened in those states, and then those got halted by court injunctions from lawsuits, and that population is still considered protected. There's basically no harvest there. And then there's the Northern Rockies population, so Montana, Idaho, Utah, Wyoming. That population started to trickle into northern Colorado. And then the voters in Colorado got a ballot initiative that passed that forced the state of Colorado to reintroduce gray wolves. Most of the heavy livestock producing states in the Northern Rockies refused to provide wolves as a source for those. And so they had to look elsewhere. There are also some wolves in like Oregon, Northern California. There's a few wolves, and those are all what we would consider more like a timber wolf, gray wolf. There's one species of gray wolf, right? But then there's also Mexican gray wolves, and those have been reintroduced close to the Mexican border. There's some in New Mexico, Arizona, and down in that area.
So what do gray wolves eat? They're predators, right? Do they eat? Is it a problem for livestock? Do they eat cows?
Yeah, well, they absolutely kill livestock, yes. When we think about canids, the smallest canids eat almost nothing but mice and insects and that sort of stuff. Then you got coyotes, and coyotes are just incredible generalists. They eat insects, they eat small mammals, they eat rabbits, they eat some deer fawns, they kill a few adult deer, not very many, and they absolutely take some livestock. Gray wolves are bigger. They need more calories when they eat and that sort of thing, and they're much less of a generalist than coyotes are. And so, thinking about during pre-European settlement times, gray wolves in the plains followed herds of bison around. And they killed calves, they killed sick bison, the old and stuff like that. They killed deer. So they're absolutely genetically programmed to take larger prey items, and livestock are included in that, and they can have a significant impact on livestock.
I think it's also important to point out that they serve an important function, right?
Yeah.
And so regulating all of the different trophic levels, there's a lot of research. Drew, you're probably a lot more familiar with it than I am, but shows that having wolves in certain areas causes cascading effects where you see, things down to like the types of plants that are growing in an area changing because the amount of mice might change, and the types of birds, and even they've done studies that have shown that terrestrial changes like that can change the fish community and rivers and stuff. So, the connections from having a predator in an area, they may cause problems if they're in the wrong area, but they can also be really beneficial and cause or lead to a lot of improvements back to changes that we wouldn't think of, right? So water quality changes in water. Who's going to think that a wolf can impact that, right?
Is there anything similar they're working on for fishery stuff? Is there any fish they're trying to recreate? I don't want to say bring back, but
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with that. We tend to not have as much, fish aren't as fuzzy as much. They're not quite as cuddly. And so, I don't know of any research that's directly related to the fish, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was, it would be, probably some sort of trophy fishery type deal where people wanted to go catch something that's big and pretty. So I don't know of any of that. There are other types of genetic manipulations that we do. And so if we think about breeding programs, it could be as simple as that, where we're going out and we're picking, the biggest fish to make offspring from, right? And so that the fish that you make offspring are called brood stock. And so we might go out and make sure we have really big, pretty fish. We want to do that. Largemouth bass are common. There's a Florida strain of a largemouth bass. It's, they're breeding them with peacock bass and making these really, really pretty big fish that they can fight and they look pretty. And so there are a lot of things like that where people are, we're manipulating the genetics either in a lab or, people are even doing it in their ponds on a much less sophisticated level. But genetic altering is something that we've been doing for a really long time, right? I mean, if you go out and harvest peas, that was one of the studies that was done because it's relatively quick to get a bunch of peas, but you want to pick the biggest peas and you want to plant those so next year you get bigger peas. And so genetic manipulations, maybe manipulation's not the right word there, but working with genetics is something that we've been doing probably as long as humans have been around. We didn't realize what it was called at the beginning.
Yeah, look at pugs.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great example of that. A pug shouldn't exist. It's about every problem that there is. But
well, corn used to have a seed head that looked about like blue stem, Eastern gamma grass.
It just looks like a grass, right? Yeah, and now we're eating it, all the time. So that's just, genetic manipulations.
Once again, that was part of the Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode. You can listen to the full episode by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Tuesday show with a cattle market update from University of Nebraska-Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis. Elliott, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Elliott, what are we seeing for feeder cattle prices right now?
Yeah, feeder cattle prices continue to march higher really across all the regions. When we think about here, kind of where I'm at in Nebraska, we've really seen extremely high prices and have kind of continued to tick up, $4.17 per hundredweight for 5/6 weights. And when we think about where we're at on 7/8 weights, we've crossed that threshold of $3.20 per hundredweight. And the feeder cattle index is, I would say lagging behind a little bit when we look at kind of where those prices are at. Feeder cattle index was about $2.95, so about $25 more per hundredweight here in Nebraska than we think about that 12 market average. So Nebraska's still kind of setting, high prices kind of in that market. Other places, have also, have higher prices for, let's say that 5/6 weights. But, really Nebraska kind of leading the board there when we think about just kind of where the feeder cattle market could go. And the other cash prices are coming along.
What are we seeing for fed cattle?
Yeah, fed cattle was kind of an interesting week. We started out, the futures was about 212. When we think about kind of where the market was going, we had a couple reports that came out last week, which was the WASDE report. Think about kind of the grain situation, kind of where's our supply and demand at. The past week, the cattle on feed report. And that's, so we saw a lot of trade kind of middling through the week. And then, on Friday, there wasn't a huge consensus on where it would go. And really people just chose to kind of seem like to sit out rather than take a position in the market and really kind of leveled out both in the early months in June and a little bit in the October months.
Elliott, are you surprised at all with the price movements we're seeing for the futures market?
No, not really. I mean, when we think about kind of where we're at, 6 weeks ago even, there was a lot of still concern about kind of the export market and, these tariffs that were coming into place. Then earlier this month, we got kind of trade numbers, and it really showed that it wasn't the damage wasn't too bad. We think about our primary trade partners in Canada. It was really about sixes, when we think about where we're at last year compared to where we ended up this year. Really, I think, when we think about kind of domestic supply going into, the summer months, really it has to do with demand. Can demand continue to keep up, and will consumers continue to pay higher prices for beef at retail? As long as we continue to see demand strong, which we have, especially during the growing months, we'll continue to have, higher prices for cattle. But as soon as that kind of starts to break a little bit, then we can see downward pressure on prices through the supply chain.
You mentioned the Cattle on Feed report came out last Friday, and what did you see from that report?
The report was really unsurprising when we think about the aggregate numbers. Think about kind of where we're at on, total cattle on feed. It was about 98% is kind of where the market was kind of putting it at. And, on feed in April, that's where the analysts kind of pegged it pretty much right at. Placed on feed in April, it was about 97%. Once again, the analysts were right on. They were skewing a little bit heavier, but, on average, it was 97. That's where we saw the biggest kind of discrepancy amongst analysts, kind of had a pretty wide range there. But on average, across all the analysts that we survey is about 97%. So on average, you're right, but there were some differences, people a little bit higher, a little bit lower. And then fed cattle marketings was pretty much right on the money. So we think about kind of where we're at. No surprise on feed. No real surprise in cattle marketed, but placed on feed is where we saw a lot of 10% difference between the highs and the lows.
What do you think caused that big difference?
I think a lot of people we're trying to figure out, what were these higher prices that we talked about previous in the feeder cattle market, and kind of lining it up with cost of feed and trying to figure out kind of where that, October market's going to be. A lot of times when we're thinking about, going into, cattle being placed in this month are 6 months away from being harvested. So it's not necessarily what the current market is doing. It's, what the future markets are going to be doing. A lot of just, I'd say, discrepancies on, where that market potentially could go.
Did you see any hints of what we could be seeing when we look into the future cattle herd?
That was kind of the big thing of the report. Heifers as a share of total cattle on feed has continued to come down. When we look at typical triggers for expansion, we generally see that in the 36% to low 37%. That's the percent of total of heifers as a percent of total cattle on feed. And really we're at middle, 37.5. So it's kind of continued to come down. So there is some indication that, quarter over quarter, even though it doesn't seem like it, because we still have such a large percentage of heifers on feed, but fewer and fewer are being placed. And so one of the things that could potentially, impact that could just be, total prices through the supply chain. So really trying to keep making sure that, as those prices continue to go higher, there's more and more incentives to kind of retain heifers.
Did you see heavier placements for weight when you looked at the cattle on feed report?
Yeah, I mean, another thing of these reports is it gives kind of weight distribution. When we think about kind of where we're at in the Cornhusker state, we have about 20 to 25% of cattle that are being placed at 900 pounds plus. Those are heavy cattle. And even if we are to take the 800, 900 pound cattle, we're at 30-35% of all the cattle being placed here are pretty heavy. Where we're at, and at least for us, we are continuing to see kind of grow yards, play a big role in the market. These are contractor, dollars per head, per day kind of charges, clean up some health, get them, bunk broke before they're placed in the feed yards. So those are becoming more and more common here in Nebraska, and really for larger feed yards, in locations where they're buying cattle. And then they're being shipped to Nebraska at heavier weights. So continue to see lots of heavier placements, and that's really just a change, in a philosophy in how we place cattle and why we're doing it.
As we're thinking about the cattle market, was there some major news around a meat packing plant recently?
We have the cattle, they got to be processed. We often talk about kind of where slaughter's at, but really the workers that kind of go there are a big factor in that. And recently we saw JBS, one of the, top 4 packers, which we have, plants here in Nebraska. Basically the employees, renegotiated a union contract. And really what it ended up doing is giving, a pension. So when we think about kind of the last time a pension plan was offered for meat processing plants, it was in 1986. So that was a long time ago. And so when we think, really what it's trying to do is, gives them, pay raises plus some back pay and, some more sick time and stuff. So including some, changes to what they call ergonomics of basically reduced work fatigue and also workplace injury. So they would, the union would classify that as when, some of these is going to, higher input costs. And so really the question is, who, if anyone, follow suit from the other major packers.
And while we're thinking about the cattle market, also thinking about New World screwworm, and what are some costs associated with it?
Yeah, I mean, the New World screwworm, of course, has continued to get attention like I think it deservedly, and it deserves so. And really it's just because of the pace at what it's moving at. When we think about breaking it down and putting security thresholds, the farther and farther it comes up, the more and more difficult it is to, create a security threshold because Mexico becomes wider and wider as it gets closer to the United States. And really the ERS has come out with some work, the Economic Research Service from USDA, really trying to estimate, what is the impact of New World screwworm or the potential impact. To give you an idea of, this has been around for a long time, 30s and 40s, when they started the eradication program. Really the, 70s is when they got super serious about it. And really we've continued to put the same amount of money towards eradication every year. So it's not like we've been investing more. But, this can be a large effect, for Texas alone in 2024, if we had New World screwworm at the rates that we saw in the past, it'd be $1.8 billion to the Texas economy and about $732 million just to producers. So not only is it the cost of just animal loss, but it's, 42% of that's from death loss. Another, 17% is lost because you can't actually sell them. So you're talking, 60% of, value of animals that are just worthless essentially. And then you have just, labor and other expenses. So this is not, not an easy program or disease to eradicate. And it's also a pretty costly one if it gets into the United States. So something we need to think about just as like biosecurity and, with ports being shut down again, this is a serious thing that we need to be prepared for as producers and really be thinking about biosecurity. New World screwworm, I think, is a good start for us because it's tangible, it's coming, but it really applies to all other biosecurity measures like foot and mouth disease and a lot of other protocols that, if they arrive to the U.S., they're very costly, and we just need to have appropriate protocol to protect ourselves and our operations.
Elliott, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That was University of Nebraska at Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. With fly season about to kick into high gear, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk is encouraging dairy producers to take steps now to reduce the potential for fly populations to skyrocket on their dairy this spring and summer. He recommends a multi-pronged approach combining sanitation, biological control, and targeted insecticides.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning fly control on your dairies. As we move into the summer months, you probably notice that the fly populations are starting to build on your dairy. It's important that you understand something about the life cycle of flies, and we think about house flies, which generally constitute a majority of the flies that we actually see on the dairy, although we do have issues with stable flies and horn flies and some face flies as well. But when we really look at the heavy fly populations on our dairy, a lot of times those are associated with house flies. House flies develop actually fairly quick. Their normal life cycle, they will live about 6 to 8 weeks, and During that time period, they'll lay about 2,000 eggs. Those 2,000 eggs can quickly develop into adult flies depending on the temperature. Generally, in about 3 to 5 days, we start to see them emerging, and basically they can complete this total cycle in about 9 to 14 days. So as you think about their lifespan and you think about the number of flies a single fly might be able to produce if it hatched in April, by the end of the summer, July or August, it may actually result in the production of about 64 million flies. So control of flies is very, very important if we want to keep the population down on our dairies. As you look at the flies that are on your dairy, just think about how many they will produce by the end of the summer if you do not do something about it. So when you look at our control programs, we always talk about sanitation first, because when we look at the flies that emerge from bedding and other sources on our farm, it could account for maybe 85% of the flies that have been produced on our farm. So try to remove as much of the manure, as much of the old spoiled feed, and those areas where flies are likely to lay eggs, such as grass growing around the dairy. It's important to make sure that we try to limit the amount of breeding space that those flies have. For those of you with freestall barns, another thing that we often forget is along the curb, we sometimes accumulate feed, particularly if we have sprinklers over our feed lines. We get a wet area right on top of that concrete curb, feed collects there, and that can become an area where flies will lay eggs and larvae will develop. So sometimes they're developing right in the pen where our animals are at. As you look at some other things that you need to consider for fly control in your adult cattle, larvicides can be very effective. They should have been started back before fly season actually started, but if you haven't utilized a larvicide, starting now would not necessarily be a bad thing to do. It will start controlling the flies as you go forward in the summer. Recent study at Kansas State University has shown that larvicides can reduce the percentage of flies emerging by more than 80%. However, if you've not started it yet, you will still need to continue to spray and do other things to control adult flies until you get enough larvicide into the manure system that it actually starts controlling those larvae that are developing in that manure source. Some other things that you might want to think about is keeping your fly control strategies, doing some mixing of the types of chemicals that you use. Sometimes we do get resistance to some of these chemicals, so you may have to switch to a different chemical. And keep in mind with lactating dairy cows, you should only be using a product that's actually approved for use on lactating dairy cows. Not all fly control products that are approved for use in cattle are also approved for use in lactating dairy cows. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy producers to carefully consider their fly control program and try to stay ahead of the curve as we go through the summer so that you can control the fly populations on your dairy farms.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.